that you should take a position and you believe in one or the other. I think in many ways, some of the so-called hard skills can be quite delicate as well. So if I look at people who are good at technical things, often they're doing it in quite an intuitive, kind of felt sense kind of a way. So I think it is a bit misleading. But as long as we don't kind of take it too literally, it can be useful. And certainly for people in positions of leadership, which is often where I spend my time, leaders actually themselves do very little. They're always trying to get other people to do things. So the soft stuff, as it's called, is of paramount importance.
Can we talk a little bit about ambiguity? I think this is a concept that I sort of took from your book. I've been thinking about a little more broadly, and particularly its role in terms of innovation and creativity. A lot of training and learning people, their job is to remove ambiguity, right? To get clarity. You get people super clear on a process or an approach. But ambiguity is a really interesting thing. I think it's the heart of a lot of humor, for example, and creativity. How do you think about ambiguity in the context of your work around leadership and, this sort of improv approach?
I mean, there's many definitions of leadership, but for me, the territory of leadership is by definition ambiguous. So if I distinguish between leadership and management is solving those problems we can identify and isolate and executing them well. And leadership is dealing with the unknown, the uncertain, the ambiguous. And that's why we have leaders, is to help us to feel comfortable enough or safe enough in those circumstances. And so I think that when, what's interesting is you'll never eliminate ambiguity. As we move forwards, as there's novelty and change, I mean, there's no data about the future. There's data about what we think might be the future. But about the future always holds uncertainty and change. And so if leadership is about moving into the future in one way or another, then you've got to be able to cope with that ambiguity and the things that have yet to happen and how you might prepare for them, or how you might respond to them once they do. If you think of something as current as the pandemic, so there's a lot of talk now about what people should have done. And there's less talk about the fact that we didn't know that it was going to unfold like this. And we need to be careful here because there will be other pandemics and they'll be different. And we don't know now from this one. We have to be careful to work out what will be common and what do we have to prepare for that will be different. So that kind of challenge, which I think is an intrinsic part of leadership, I don't see that you can eliminate ambiguity. And there's a psychologist I work with at Oxford, John Stokes, who's very eloquent about this. And he says that leadership is a swamp. And it has in it the island of management, which is firm ground where you know where you are. And you need to keep doing some of that. But if you're not in the swamp, you're not leading. You might be doing something valuable, but you're not leading. So for him, as well as for me, that ambiguity is part of it. For improv, as a story unfolds, or use that as an analog for a relationship or a conversation or a product, there are always going to be unknowns. And so you're working with not just solving the problems that the ambiguity presents. There's another side to this, which is the ambiguity or the unknown holds promise. So you can make something better than you could have imagined if you're willing to embrace the ambiguity. If you cleave tight to just doing what you knew in advance, the best you can do is what you can imagine beforehand. So the example I think of, we built our own house on a mountaintop in rural Spain, and there are many features of that house, some of the best features, which weren't in the plans, because we were able to deal with that kind of unfolding ambiguity as the house was made and spot opportunities to change things that actually made it better, as well as solve the problems along the way that we needed to get the structure built.
In the sort of pandemic and the lockdown, our ability to plan is one of the things that seems to make us so anxious. Like everybody wants to know what's the date at which we can get back to work. When can I schedule that flight to Spain? When can I get back into a world where I can plan and be organized? I mean, what are you seeing about how people are responding to the lack of clarity about the future? Not that there's ever real clarity about the future, but it feels like that's been any illusion of it has been just pulled from under us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I've seen far more individuals and small businesses respond in extraordinary and brilliant ways than I have governments or large companies I haven't had much dealing with in the last few weeks. So I'm a bit blindsided by that. But if I, and even within different government responses, I see those that are more still kind of trying to command and control the problem. And I would say that the UK's response has been that. And I think, I don't want to start throwing rocks because I don't think that's particularly useful, but I do think there's been a limitation to that sort of centralized nature of it. Talking to people I know that work in the health service about things still needing to be approved by central authorities. Whereas as I understand it, and I don't know much about it, in Germany, much more power has been devolved to different regions where different strategies have been tried, different regimes have been tested, different processes according to the context and the judgment and the skills of the people involved. And so the aggregated learning has been much faster, but the system has been much more responsive. The result seems to be much more effective. So those would seem to be, I'd need to know more about it and understand it more, but there's some clues there. If I look at my immediate environment, talking of David Hyatt at the Do Lectures, their whole business is events, none of which can be done now. And they, within 3 weeks of lockdown, were inviting people to do a Do lecture online. I did the first one actually from my front room here. So we started to do that to just as a response. And then kind of serving their audience, that wasn't in any way remunerated, but they were continuing to think of their audience and what might be useful and put stuff out that they thought would be valuable. And in the meantime, they pulled together a course called the Keyboard CEO, which they ran incredibly successfully, which is an online learning course for small business owners. And I was talking with them just yesterday, and they said it's unbelievable the response that has created, and the strength and depth of relationships amongst the people that came on that course. And they kind of invented that out of nothing as a response to the crisis within a matter of weeks.
One of the companies that I follow very closely is Airbnb, and their business has been completely decimated.
I imagine, yeah.
Wow. And yet they've spun up this new business called Experiences, where for a really modest sum you can connect with somebody, say in Italy, who'll teach you how to cook from their kitchen.
Yeah.
Or there's an incredible one called The Dogs of Chernobyl, the kind of wild dogs of Chernobyl. And you can, be in this guy's home and go out with him and feed some of these dogs.
What's interesting about that is, in a way, it doesn't surprise me, because I think that in the core of Airbnb was this understanding of what they were offering at a different level. That they were really, their brand position was about, we're gonna use hospitality to build community and relationship. So then they're able to hold on, because it's one thing I'd like to make really clear to people is that this improv way of working is not a substitute. It's not the be all and end all. It's not the only thing you should ever do. And I think it's sometimes people attack it for the reason that they think that people like me are advocating it is. What it is an absolutely necessary complement to all the other things. So if, like Airbnb, you have this business that's based on this hospitality, we have a deeper understanding of what it's really about, then when something like this comes, you can flex and adapt in a way that complements the infrastructure. So they're still using the infrastructure they've got, so you can watch the guy with the dogs in Chernobyl. And that kind of a response, I think, is a beautiful illustration of how this stuff can work.
Yeah, and at the same time, you need operational excellence as well, and you need the World Health Organization coordinating the response from scientists and so on and so forth. I think it is an amazing time, and I think people will study this period of time for a long time. I've got one other story that you might like, and that is a local restaurant here in Seattle, which is called Canlis, and it's a very sort of high-end restaurant. It's probably been around since the 50s. It's the kind of place you go to celebrate, your golden wedding anniversary, very high class, flunky service, family run business. They immediately, like within the first week of lockdown here in Seattle, they published a press release and they said, the last thing Seattle needs right now is fine dining. So we're going to close our restaurant and we're going to open 3 restaurants that will serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner to needy families. We are going to set up a drive-through where you can come and get a prepared meal for your family in the evening, and you can pick up. And I just thought, everyone else was panicked. And here was a response that I think was beautifully improvised, again, from, them understanding what their sort of core value was and just finding a different way to do it. I thought that was a beautiful story. And of course, many other restaurants have sort of followed suit. But
and that shows a willingness to let go of what would normally be called their core competence, the fine dining thing. And that's such a contrast to people just issuing vacuous messages about we're here for you and, we understand and in these unprecedented times. And that's just vacuous air, really. Show me,
I want to talk about modern learning and development. I'm sure you work with lots of L&D teams and you're in the business of professional development and leadership development. And I didn't invite you on this call to encourage people to do improv in their leadership development programs, although that might be a good thing to do. I'm really interested in how we apply this practice to the practice of learning and development, which needs to respond to a changing world. Do you have a point of view on that?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you asked that actually in that way, because I think this might sound a strange thing for me to say, but I think the inclusion simply of kind of a bit of improv as a fun and games lightener within an L&D program is the least interesting bit. It could be of value, but I think it's the least interesting bit. My interest has always been in this area, which is how do these deeper principles inform the way we think about the big stuff, the important stuff. So I think that if it goes down to, it kind of comes back to your idea of what idea of pedagogy you have really is, how do we think about how people learn? So if you live in a stable world with identifiable problems, which are mostly technical that you want to solve, that you can predict in advance, then you can kind of plan and program your way towards good and effective solutions. But so that's a sort of a model pedagogically that's about transmitting knowledge. And the knowledge is robust and it's based on the past and it's, sort of steeped in best practice. But that all assumes that you're going to be facing the same or similar problems with similar resources and similar kind of competitive threats and challenges. And that's not in the main the world that we find ourselves in now. So it's not that that's wrong, it's that it's not enough. So that what we now need to be able to do is to shift towards thinking about how do we build a responsive capacity? How do we build in the capacity to gather information quickly, try out things that might succeed or fail in some measure, learn from that quickly, iterate, and go back out? And again, you can apply this directly to the crisis, the coronavirus crisis. Those governments that have been able to, and those responses where they've been able to kind of learn fast by trying lots of small things. In the complexity jargon, these would be called catalytic probes. You don't know what the answer is, you'd better try more than one thing, because otherwise you're putting all your eggs in one basket. So for L&D, I think to actually accept and understand that that we can't know everything in advance, but we don't need to understand that, if you like, what got me into improv in the first place was an understanding, oh my God, there is still stuff you can learn here. There is still stuff which is useful. There's ideas, language, concepts, tools, all of which can be deployed flexibly and in a kind of powerful way, even when you don't know what's coming, or in fact, especially when you don't know what's coming. So there's not nothing you can do, and that there's a much more intelligent response than simply trying to control everything. So I think that starts with accepting that some things are uncontrollable, and then working perhaps with people from different arenas, different skill bases, like I've done, improvisers, but there will be other constituencies that can teach us about how you kind of learn and grow in responsive, flexible ways. So I think it's a kind of philosophical shift that's needed, not to abandon that kind of programmatic thing, but to understand its limitations and to realize that you're putting good energy, kind of more energy off, what's the saying? Good money after bad, so anyway, you can spend more and more effort on trying to control less and less. And if you take that energy, effort, and ideas and loosen up and sit and sort of step back, then you'll find a whole host of things you can do that could be really effective.
Rob, can you just briefly give us your elevator pitch for your the next book in your series, which is the book Do Pause, which seems so relevant right now. We're in this massively unplanned pause. That's how it feels like to me anyway. What's the offer that this enforced pause might represent to us?